Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Computer Science Club's APCSA exam review for the 2021 APCSA exam. Today, we'll be going over the exam format, followed by some multiple choice questions, an FRQ problem, and then a question and answer session where you can ask questions about content or the format of the exam. So now we'll briefly cover the format for this year's exam.
So for the exam, there are two parts. There's a multiple choice part and there's an FRQ part. So for the multiple choice section, you're given 1.5 hours and to solve 40 questions. And most of these questions are asked alone with the exception of 4 questions about where will be in a set. So like what I mean by a set is like you might be given some code and you might have 2 questions following it that are connected to that code. But aside from that, most of the questions are going to have are going to be on its own, not within a set. And there's another section which is the FRQ. You'll have 1.5 hours to do 4 questions, and it also has a 50% weight. And each question is worth 12.5%. So if we go on the next slide, it goes into the FRQ in depth. So every single year, the FRQ is in this exact format where the first question is going to be about methods and control structures. And what this means is like how it's kind of testing your ability to utilize methods. So like given a class and given some methods, for example, getting the leap year, the next leap year, it's going to ask you to like utilize some of those methods in a class. And that's what the first question is usually about. And the first question, you also have to deal with instantiating an object usually for an object class. For the second question, you're asked about object-oriented programming. So you're going to have to most likely develop your own class, your instance variables, your getters, your setters, and your mutator methods. The third question is typically an array or array list problem. So make sure you know how to do that. And the fourth question is always going to be about 2D arrays. So those are the formats of that's the format of the FRQ. And that will be on this year's FRQ. So make sure you know how to do those 4 things, and that'll be half the test.
Yep. And just a quick introduction, I'm Ishan, and I'm the president of Computer Science Club.
I'm Kanish. I'm the vice president.
My name is Vidhu, and I'm secretary.
Yep. So the questions that we'll be going over are on the AP Computer Science 8 course and exam description. I just pasted the link into the chat, and it starts on page 198. You can see I have number 1 open over here. We're going to go over it together. You can open it up using the link in the chat if you want to, or you can just look at the Zoom meeting. So in this first multiple choice question, we have 2 variables. They're both integers, int a equals 5, int b equals 2. We also have a double, and double c is equal to 3.0. And they're printing out this expression over here inside the println function, and they're asking us what is printed when the code segment is executed. So basically, we have to evaluate this expression over here and determine what is printed out. And just like how we would do it by hand, in code, it's going to execute it following the order of operations, which means division is going to be done first. Now you have to pay special attention to the data types. So here we're doing a divided by b, and both of them are integers. So what it's going to do is integer division. It's going to do 5 divided by 2, and it's going to get 2 from this over here, because it does not pay attention to the stuff that comes after the decimal point. It does not store that information. So a divided by b is going to give us 2, and then we multiply it by c. C is a double with a value of 3.0, which means that 2 times 3.0 is going to be 6.0. So that's another important thing to note. Because one of the variables in our expression, 2 times 3.0, is a double, it's going to perform double arithmetic. So now we have 5 plus this quantity here, which is 6.0. 5 plus 6.0 is 11.0. 11.0 minus 1 is 10.0. And the answer for that question is C. Are there any questions about this first question over here? Okay. If not, we'll move on to the second one. So in this problem, we have this process words method. It takes in 2 strings, and the precondition for the strings are that they have a length of at least 2. And I'll zoom in a bit on this code segment over here so you can take a look at what the function does. And then I'll scroll down for the answer choices. The question is asking us which of the following best describes the value printed when process words is called. So if we take a closer look, and let's actually go over some of the answer choices. We have the value 0 is always printed. And by the way, you can see over here that the process words function will print out result.index of string 2. So our answer choices are the value 0 is always printed, the value 1 is always printed, the value result.length -1 is printed, and then we have some other options with a where it prints out a substring. And we can immediately cross out answer choices D and E because we know that the index of function of a string is going to return the index, which is an integer. It's not going to return a substring. So that narrows down our answer choices to A, B, and C. But before we determine what the answer is, we have to actually examine what the function does. So let's take a look at an example when string str1 is equal to cat, when string str1 is equal to cat, and when string str2 is equal to dog. So in this example over here, what it's going to do, sorry, I meant word1. This is the value of word1, and this is the value of word2. So now what it's going to do is it's going to set str1 equal to word1.substring 0, 2. And this is something that you need to know. If you take a look at this page 226 of the same document, there are two versions of the substring method in Java. One version of the function which takes in 2 parameters will return a substring starting from the first parameter and going right just before the second parameter. So it's going to give us a substring from index from up to index 2 minus 1. That means in this example over here, word1.substring 0, 2 is going to give us the first 2 letters of word1. And this is what str1 is going to be equal to. So str1 equals CA in our example. And word2.substring is for the parameter, we're passing in word2.length -1. We're just passing in one parameter. And for the substring method, when you pass in one parameter, it's going to give you a substring starting at that index and going all the way to the end of the string. And because word2.length -1 is the index of the last character inside word2, str2 is going to be equal to just G, just the last character. And now they say that result is equal to str2 plus str1. So in our example, it's going to be equal to GCA. And finally, on the last line, they're printing out result.index of str2. And keep in mind, str2 is equal to G. The index of G in result is going to be 0. And the answer for this problem, as we saw in this example, is that this function is always going to print out 0. And the reason for this is because result is just a string composed of str2, then str1. And because str2 is in the front, the index of str2 is always going to be 0. So for this question, the answer is A. And it tested your knowledge of the substring method, as well as the index of method. Next, we'll move on to question 3, which tests your knowledge of the math.random function. And over here, they're asking us which of the following statements will assign a random integer between 25 and 36. 25 and 60, sorry. Now, does anybody remember what the math.random function does? What does it give us? And if you know, you can unmute yourself or type it into the chat. Yep, that's correct. Yeah.
If you didn't know that, by the way, it's on the reference sheet also. So if you don't know what a method does, you always make sure to check the reference sheet. I'll link it in the chat.
Yeah, so what math.random does is it gives us a number from the range of 0 to 1. And the 0 is inclusive, the 1 is exclusive. So what happens is when we multiply this by 25, our range then becomes 0, the closed interval, 0 is inclusive, and 25 is exclusive. And when we cast it to an int, as you can see that they do in the answer choices, what this does is it gets rid of the stuff after the decimal. It essentially truncates the decimal or rounds down, whatever you want to think of. That means that now when we cast it to an int after multiplying it by 25, our range of possible values is going to be the integers from 0 up to 24. That's what this over here is going to do. And when we add 36 to it, all it's going to do is just shift it over to the range from 36 to 60. And I'll drag this up a bit so you can see it. So that's what answer choice A does. But they want the statement which assigns a random integer between 25 and 36. So if we use what we just observed over here, 25 to 60 includes 36 different numbers. When we multiplied by 25, we got a range of 25 possible values. So it stands to reason that if we multiply by 36, we're going to get a range of 36 possible values. And when we get a range of 36 possible values, that's going to be from 0 to 35. If we want it to be from 25 to 60, we have to shift that over, and we shift it over by adding 25 to it. So the answer for this problem is going to be D. In summary, you multiply math.random by the number of possible values that you want to have. 25 to 60 is 36 possible values, so we multiply by 36. And then you add the smallest value, which is 25.
So just to add on, if you're having trouble figuring out it's 36, the formula is max minus min plus 1. So 60 minus 25 plus 1. And that's the formula for what you want to multiply math.random by for your range.
Yeah. And in this next question, we have this code segment over here consisting of multiple if statements. And basically there are these vehicles that are classified based on their internal volume. The classify method is intended to return a vehicle classification string value based on the total interior volume in cubic feet as shown in the table below. The classify method over here does not work as intended because there's a problem with it, and the question will ask us about this problem. And you can see that we receive an int volume as the parameter, and based on this volume, it's going to determine the class of the car. And the goal is for the function to return the classes based on the size as reflected in this table. But there's something wrong with this function. And let's just quickly scroll over to the actual questions so we know what to look for. They tell us that the classify method does not work as intended, but it does work as intended for some values, but not all of them. And we have to find which of the following values of volume will the function work correctly for. And our possible values are 80, 90, 105, 109, and 115. So for only one of these possible values does the function work correctly. Let's go back to our function and examine what it does and why it's wrong, because that's important to know. Let's start at the top. So in our code, if volume is greater than or equal to 120, it's going to set the class equal to large. And if you look at our table over here, that's correct. If the volume is greater than or equal to 120, the class is large. What happens if the volume is less than 120? So we continue down in the code, and this else if statement over here says that if the volume is less than 120, the car class is going to be equal to mid-size. And the following statements are also else ifs. So does something seem wrong about this statement over here? Or do you think it's fine? I think something seems wrong over here. I think something seems wrong over here because let's say the volume is going to be 50 cubic feet. If the volume is 50 cubic feet, 50 is less than 120, which means that this over here is going to get executed. And if the volume if the volume is 50 feet, that's a mini compact car. It's not a mid-sized car. And that's why our function is wrong. The reason the function is wrong is because if the volume is less than 120, we don't have a guarantee that it's going to return the correct result. It will only give us the correct result if the volume is between 119 and 110. Because if the volume is less than 110 over here, like for example, if the class is supposed to be compact, this code segment over here is never going to run. Because if this is true, if volume is less than 110, that means volume is less than 120, which means this statement over here is going to run and none of the statements below it are going to run. So that's why it's only going to work if the intended car class was mid-size between 110 to 119. We scroll down and we look at our answer choices, that's going to be 115. So that's one way to go about the problem. It would be to actually examine the code and figure out what's wrong with it, which you can do fairly quickly. It took us a while because I was explaining the reasoning behind it. The second thing that you could do is go out and try every single one of the answer choices, plug in 80, see where that gets you, check if it's correct or not. But during the actual test, the way that we did it by checking the actual code and seeing where it went wrong and why, that would probably be the faster way to do it. Yes, as Matthew pointed out, it would also work for large, but that was not one of the answer choices that they provided. And now we have question number 5, which tests your knowledge of Boolean expressions. And this is a good one over here. I'll give you some time to look at it. It's asking us which of the following best describes the value of the Boolean expression shown here. It does not explicitly say it, but A and B are Boolean variables themselves. And we need to determine what this expression evaluates to and when it evaluates to that. So our answer choices include the value is always true, the value is always false. The value is true when A has the value false and is false otherwise. The value is true when B has the value false and is false otherwise. Or answer choice E, the value is true when either A or B has the value true and it's false otherwise. Now there are a couple of ways to go about this problem. And as usual, there is one way that's quicker than the rest. Let's just start with the way that's a little slower. And that would be to make a truth table and try out every single possible value for A and B. So if you remember back from our unit in APCSA with Boolean expressions, we can just draw a truth table and we can test multiple different values for A and B. So we can try the case where they're both true and see what that evaluates to. We can see what A and not B or A evaluates to. We could try true and false, then false and false, and then false and true. And because there are only 2 variables, there's going to be 4 different combinations, and that's fine. It shouldn't take too long. And based on what you observe from all 4 of these, you can then determine what the answer is. But there is a better way to go about this problem. Who here remembers what De Morgan's law is? Does that sound familiar to you guys? De Morgan's law? If it doesn't, that's fine. We're going to go over it. So De Morgan's law, which we learned about in APCSA, is, as Matthew put into the chat, it states that if we have this expression over here, not the quantity of B or A, this is equal to not B and not A. So if we come over here to the statement A and not the quantity of B or A, we can replace this not B or A with this over here because they're equal to each other. And there's a reason for why we want to replace it. So now our expression will look like, once we replace it, it's going to be A and not B and not A. Now I want you to focus on this particular part over here, A and not A. A and not A will always be false because they're literally opposites of each other. If A is true, not A is false. If A is false, not A is true. So taking the and of both of them will always be false. And that's why the answer for 5 is B. This would be the quick way to do it. If you recognize that, oh, okay, this is just De Morgan's law, I can replace it with this expression over here, and I have A and not A. The answer is always going to be false. So that's how you do that question. Are there any questions about De Morgan's law? I should point out that just like how it works for the or, it also works for and. So if I have not A and B, this is equal to not A or not B. It's similar for the ands and the ors. Okay. And that concludes my part of the MCQ questions. Madhu will do the next 5 problems. So I'll stop sharing and hand it over to him. And if you have any questions, you can ask them in the chat. If you don't want others to see them, you can private message one of us officers privately. Okay, Madhu, you can now share the screen.
Here, can we see question 6?
Yeah.
Okay. For question 6, we're asked to consider the following code segment. So before we look at the code segment, we'll just see what the question is asking, so we know what to look for when we're reading the code segment. So it asks what is printed when the code segment is executed. And what you want to do is just quickly glance through your answers. So here we're like, it just shows that it's going to print a bunch of numbers, and there's no answer choice that says there's an error within the code. So that means the code segment will execute correctly, and there's no syntax errors within our code statement or logical errors. So here we're given int val is equal to 48, div is equal to 6, and we run a while loop. And the while loop will run if val mod 2 is equal to 0 and if div is greater than 0. So if this statement is true, then the first thing we're going to check is if val mod div is equal to 0, and if it is 0, that's when we'll actually print something out. And then afterwards, no matter what happens, like if this is true or false, which doesn't really matter, then we'll print these. Then we'll do these next two statements. Val is equal to val divided by 2, and div is equal to div minus 1. So the best way to go about these problems is to create a chart. And here's an example of a chart I've written up. So here I'm going to track the values of val and div throughout our code. Then for the while loop, I need to check if val mod 2 is equal to 0. So that's what I'm doing right here. And I also need to check if div is greater than 0. So that's the same part over there. And at the end, you might notice I check if val mod div is equal to 0. And what that is just this if statement in here. And if it is true, I'm going to print out the val. So I'll just write it down below if that is true. So initially, we're given val is 48 and div is 6. So now I'm going to check if val mod 2 is equal to 0. 48 mod 2 is 0 because there is no remainder when you divide by 2. Now, the next thing I'm going to check is if div is greater than 0. 6 is greater than 0, so I'm going to put true. Now, because both of these are true, I'm now going to go do whatever's in the while loop. So val mod div is equal to 0. So 48 divided by 6 doesn't have a remainder. So that's actually true. I'm going to print out whatever val is. And so 48. And this is going to be my space. Afterwards, what I'm going to do is val is equal to val divided by 2. 48 divided by 2 is 24. Div minus minus is 5. Now I'm going to go back to the top of the while loop and check my conditions again. So it's 24 divided by 2 equals 0. I'm going to just speed through this a bit now. So div is greater than 0, so that's true. And the next part's asking if val mod div is equal to 0. 24 divided by 5 is not equal to, does not have a remainder of 0. So it's actually going to be false, and we're not going to print anything. And then we're going to go through the last two statements. So val is equal to val divided by 2, div minus minus. And I'm going to go back to the top of the while loop and check my statements again. So 12 divided by 2 is no remainders. 4 is greater than 0. I'm going to check if val mod div is equal to 0. So 12 divided by 4 has no remainders. That is true. And I'll print out val. And then I'm just going to run the two statements at the end. So 6, and this will be 3. So 6 mod 2 is equal to 0. True. Div is greater than 0. Val mod div is equal to 0, which is true. And I'm going to print the value of val. Three, 2. And now here I'll check if val mod 2 is equal to 0. Val is 3, so that's actually false. And because this is an and, it's actually going, the for loop is just going to stop right there because of short circuiting. So afterwards, this is going to be your answer that we will want to look for. So that will be A. The next question is, consider the following class definition, public class example, and we have a instance variable private int x, and the constructor is not shown. The question is asking which of the following is a correct header for a method of the example class that would return the value of the private instance variable x so that it could be used in a class other than example. So important things to get from this question is it would return. So it's going to be a method of the example class, and this is the example class, and it would need to return the value of the private instance variable x. And it also must be able to be used in a class other than example. So like just looking at, so it has to return a value. So we have to just look for a method that returns something. So it's not going to be B, it's not going to be D, it's not going to be E. So we're left with A or C, and it must be used in a class other than example. So a private method means that it can only be used within the class it is created in. But if you use a public method, it can be used in any class actually. So we want to use a public method. So our answer is C for this one. Number 8, we're given a code segment, and we have to assume the string has been correctly declared and initialized. The code segment is intended to print the number of strings in the array animals that have str as a substring. So we're given our string animals, and it contains these animals in there. We have an int count of 0, and we're looping from int I equals 0 to I less than or equal to animals.length I++. And we're going to check the if statement down here. So if animals of I dot index of str is greater than or equal to 0, we can increase the word count. And then we can print the word, the count. So if we look at our question, it says which of the following changes should be made so that the code segment works as intended. So this tells us, like, from this question, it's saying that the code segment doesn't work. What can be changed so that it works? So the answer A is saying the Boolean expression in the for loop header should be changed to I less than animals.length. B is saying the same thing, except it wants I less than animals.length -1. And C is saying I less than animals of I.length. And D and E are both asking to change the if condition. So right off the bat, there's a lot we can actually cross out. So seeing this is a 1D array, so we can cross out C, because this if statement, like this Boolean expression, would only work for 2D arrays. So it's not C. For D, the condition in the if statement should be changed to if animals of I equals str. We can actually cross that out because the question is saying the code segment is intended to print the number of strings that have str as a substring. So if it's a substring, it has to be part of it. So that doesn't mean that str has to be equal to that substring. It just has to be a substring of it. So we don't want equals and we don't want substring, because substring only takes in a int and str is actually a string. So that leaves us off with A or B. And even if you don't know your Boolean expressions for looping through an array, what you could do is you can make like a small array of like 2 elements, and you can just loop through that array yourself, and you can be able to deduce from there that your answer is A for this one. So the next question is number 9. We need to consider an integer array of nums, and it has more than one or more integer values. We have to look at which of the following code segments updates nums, which is the array, so that each element contains the square of its own value. So the first one is going to be So if we just look at our answer choices, it's just gonna ask us to select which one we think is correct. So for looking at the first one, int k is equal to 0, and we have to check while k is less than nums.length. And it will do nums of k equals nums of k times nums of k. So if you notice something weird, it's because you're right. We're never changing the value of k here, so it's not 1. And because it's not 1, if you look at our answer choices, we can cross off B, C, and E, and we only need to check the third one actually. Because if it's not the third one, then it has to be the second one. So like that could be like some test taking strategy, but it's always best to look at like all the answer choices. So like for the purposes of strategy, you could look at the third one. And if it's not the third one, if you're on a time crunch, you can then just circle the second one. But we're just going to look at all of them for this case. For int k equals 0, k less than nums.length, k plus plus, nums of k is equal to nums of k times nums of k. So we're just multiplying the value by itself and storing it into the array nums of k, into the index. A third one is a for each loop. So for each number in nums, the value of that number is equal to that number times itself. So what's important to know is that this isn't actually updating the value in the array. It's just updating the value of that number, but it's not making any changes in the array. So it's actually not the third one, and it's just going to be the second one. So this one will be A. So for the last one, number 10, we have a code segment consisting of an array list of numbers. And the best way to work through this one is to kind of just write it out. So it's going to ask us like, what are the contents of the array list once the code has been executed? So we're going to just run through the code. So array list of a string of numbers. So that's what we're going to have. We're going to add 1. We're going to add 2. And we're going to add at the 0th index the number 3. So once the number 3 is added, it should be at the 0th index. So we're going to add it at the front. We're going to set the second index to 4. So 0, 1. This is our second index now. We're going to set it to 4. And then we're going to add 5 to the end and remove 1. So 0, 1. So afterwards, the contents of the numbers array list is going to be 3, 4, and 5, which is D. And Kanishk will do the last 5 problems.
Again, if you have any questions, you can either put it in the chat or message one of us if you don't want to publicly ask. And can you see question 11?
Yes.
Okay. So question 11 asks to consider following method, which is intended to return a list containing the elements of the parameter myList with all even elements removed. And it's asking which of the following best explains why the code segment does not work as intended. So if we look at it, we have a for loop which starts at index 0 and keeps going until I is less than myList.size. So when I looked at this question first, this index out of bounds exception jumped out at me. And I first thought, could an index out of bounds exception occur in this for loop? And it cannot, because this for loop will stop if I is greater than or equal to myList.size. And that means all the indexes will always be accessed correctly. So an index out of bounds exception cannot occur. So that's how I managed to cross out A and B. And then next is the code segment returns a list with fewer elements than intended because it fails to consider the last element of myList. And that's also wrong because it stops right at the last element. Whenever you do I is less than myList.size, or I is less than the size of an array or array list, you loop through all of the elements. So this definitely looks at the last element, so C is also wrong. And then D, that says the code segment removes the wrong elements of my list because the condition in the if statement to test whether an element is even is incorrect. So if we look at the if statement, it's doing mylist.getI, so it's getting the number correctly, and it's doing if that mod 2 is equal to 0. So that correctly checks if it's even. If it divided by 2 equals 0, or the remainder after being divided by 2 equals 0, it's even. So it correctly checks if that element is even. That means D is also false, and E is the correct answer. Number 12, considers the following code segment. So this is a 2D array. And the question is asking, what is printed when this code segment is executed? So this is a nested for loop. The first for loop looks at the rows. So int row equals 0, row is less than points.length, and the 2D array is called points, row plus plus. So this is basically going through like the first row, the second row, the third row, the fourth row. And then the second for loop starts at the row dot length, so points at 0, is this entire row. So because points is a 2D array, its first element is a 1D array. So you can tell by these commas what its elements are. So its points' first element, which is a 1D array, dot length minus 1. So it's going to start at the last element in this row. So it's going to start at 15, or 15 for this first one, for example. And it's going to keep looping while this value is greater than the row value. And then it's going to do call minus minus. So this is a bit confusing right now. That's why I recommend you like write it out, how this would look. In the beginning, row is equal to 0. So we can say row is equal to 0. And then we get into the second for loop. So int call is equal to the length of the 1D array minus 1. So the length of this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 minus 1 is 4. So column starts out at 4. Now that call is 4, we do system.out.print points at row call. So row is 0, call is 4. So on the first 2D array, we want the fourth element. So this is the first element that's going to be printed. And at the end of this for loop, we do call minus minus. So after 4 becomes 3, then it keeps doing call minus minus, so 2, 1, and 0. And it doesn't go to -1 because the terminating condition is that the column is greater than or equal to the row. So as soon as it becomes -1, the column is no longer greater than or equal to 0, which is the row. So as we can see, in this first iteration of this for loop, we called system.out.print 5 times, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. So any answer choices that don't have 5 elements on the first line, we can cross out. So it's not A and it's not B. And then moving on, now we can see, so now we can just move on to the next row. So after this interior for loop, this big for loop, like the outer for loop, increments the row by 1. So this time row becomes 1, and again, it starts at points at call starts at points at 0 dot length minus 1, which is 4. And it keeps going until call is greater than or equal to the row. So it's 4, 3, 2, 1, and this time we don't go to 0 because 0 is less than 1. So the second line should have 4 numbers on it. And this one does and this one does. We can cross this one out. And the differences between these two are in the numbers themselves. So if we look at what the first number printed is, it is this pair of row and column. So row at 0 refers to this row, Okay, and column at 4 refers to this last number, which is 15. So 15 is the first number printed, and that's the only one that has 15 as the first number. And then number 13, consider following code segment, another 2D array, and it goes through every 1D array in the 2D array, and then it goes through every element in each 1D array. And then it adds it to a global sum variable. And the question is asking, what's the value of sum as a result of executing the code segment? So if you add up everything in here, you would get 78. And you might put that as the answer, but that's not correct. Because over here, the stopping condition, instead of what's typical is it's less than the array dot length to go through all of the elements. This is less than the array dot length minus 1, which means these last elements are not considered at all. So instead of being the sum of everything, it's only the sum of these elements. And the sum of those elements is B54. And then number 14, consider the following class definitions. Public class thing1 and public class thing2 extends thing1. And they both have a calc function. So the following code segment appears in a class other than thing1 or thing2. So thing1 thing1 name t is equal to a new thing2. And now we do t.calc2. And because the right side over here is declared as a thing2 object, we're going to first do thing2's calc function. So when we do thing2's calc function, this 2 enters thing2's calc function, so n is 2. So when we do n plus equals 2, n becomes 4. And now we get super.calc. So super is when a child class inherits or extends a parent class. They can do super dot, like a method that's in the parent class, and that method will be called. I'm not going to go in depth into inheritance here. And then, so n here is 4. So now we're going to pass 4 to super.calc function. And that's over here. So n is 4. And then we do n times equals 3. So 4 times equals 3 is 12. And we'll print out n, which is 12. But that n does not change this n. This n is still 4. So now after we call this, we're going to system that out of print n, which is 4. So the answer is 12, 4. Then number 15, consider the following two methods which are intended to return the same values when they're called with the same parameter n. So we have mystery1 and mystery2, and they both take in an integer. Which, if any, of the following changes to mystery2 is required so that the two methods work as intended? So to do this, we can just like pick a sample n and see how the two methods differ when we trace the result of that sample n. So for example, this one, let's do n equals 3 for both of them. So if we do 3, let's say n is equal to 3. So if n is greater than 1, 3 is greater than 1, we'll return 5 plus mystery1 of 3 minus 1, which is 2. So that's going to return 5 plus mystery1 of 2. And then mystery1 of 2, n is still 2, which is greater than 1. So it's going to return 5 plus mystery1 of 1. And then mystery1 of 1 is not greater than 1, so it's going to go into this else, and it's going to return 1. So it's 5 plus 5 plus 1. So it's going to overall return 11. Now if we plug in 3 into this one as well, we get int total is equal to 0, int x equals 1. And while x is less than n, we're going to do total plus equals 5 and increment x. So at the beginning, x is 1. 1 is less than 3, so it's going to be total plus equals 5. So total is equal to 5 now. And now x is 2. After x is 2, 2 is still less than 3, so it's going to do total plus equals 5 again. 5 plus 5. And then x plus plus. Now x is 3. 3 is no longer less than 3, so we're going to go out. And it's going to return total. So it's going to return 5 plus 5, which is equal to 10. So in this function, we got 10, and in the other function, we got 11. So it's off by 1. And the answer choice that fixes that is A. The variable total should be initialized to 1. So if we just add 1 to that, they're both the same. Now I'm going to talk about the free response, one free response problem. And when you first read a free response problem, it might be intimidating because there's like a class with a bunch of methods that you don't really understand well. But if you just like go through it slowly, I promise you it will make sense. So this first problem is about methods and control structures like Medusa in the beginning. The first problem will always be about that. And this first part of the question is sort of description about the class that we're going to use and the methods within it. And then after, we get the first part of the question, which is to complete the getCheck method, which computes the check digit for a number according to following rules. So to do that, this like gives us the algorithm that we're going to have to implement in our code. So getCheck multiplies the first digit by 7, the second digit by 6, the third digit by 5, and so on. So yeah. And then it adds the products calculated in the previous step, and it extracts the check digit. And if you don't know what it is, it explains it right after, which is the rightmost digit of the sum calculated in the previous steps. So an example of that is, say we want to get the check digit of the number 283415. So we would do the first number times 7, then the second number times 6, and the third number times 5, the fourth number times 4, the fifth number times 3, and the sixth number times 2, just like it says here. And once we sum that up, we get this number, and the check digit is the rightmost digit of the sum. So the rightmost digit of 106 is 6, and we just return 6. Okay, thank you. So then it gives us two helper methods, get the number of digits and get digit, which have been provided. And if methods are provided, you should use them because that's part of the things you need to do to get full credit. And it says it right here. You must use get number of digits and get digit appropriately to receive full credit. And get number of digits returns the number of digits in whatever number you pass it. So for example, if you did get number of digits of the number we just worked with, 28415, it would return 6. And then get digit returns the nth digit of its int parameter. So if you did 283415 and you wanted to get the first digit of it, it would return 2. So it's not 0 indexed, it's 1 indexed. Now, with those two methods, we want to write getCheck. So to do that, I'm not going to write the whole code. I'm just going to show you the code I wrote and show you how it works. So what we need to do is we first need to keep track of the overall sum. And Also, I wanted to keep track of how much we need to multiply the current digit by. So in here, we multiply the first one by 7, and then by 6, and so on. So I kept track of the total sum and the current multiplication. And then we need to get the sums of all the digits, we need to iterate through all the digits in the number. So to do that, we need to know how many numbers are in the number. And that's one of the methods they gave, which was get number of digits. So our for loop looks like this, where I is less than the number of digits in num. And then each time, what we want to do is we want to get the digit at whatever place we are in the for loop. So to do that, we can call the get digit function. And the get digit returns the nth digit of its int parameter. So we would do get digit, the num, and I plus 1, because it's 1 index rather than 0 index. And we would multiply that by current multiplier, which is 7 in the beginning. And after we do that, we can subtract current multiplier by 1. So at the end of this, we have summed up all of the numbers, and we basically calculated this number. And after, we need to return the rightmost digit of 1 of 6. So to do that, we can do get digit, or we can get the length of the number of digits. So for example, if 283415 is 6 long, then it would return 6. And then to get the digit at the last place, we would simply ask or get number of digits or 6, or we want the number at its last index. So that would return the last number. And to showcase what the actual PP showed as the correct solution for this problem, they did it a slightly different way, but my solution would still get full credit. What they did is, instead of having a different counter for current mult, they did 8 minus I to keep track of that. And they returned sum mod 10 instead of this to get last digit. And to explain why it would give the same grading, we can look at the scoring. So the scoring criteria, we get 1 point for just calling the 2 methods, because that's what it asks for full credit. And then another point for calculating with partial sum, another point for calculating all the partial sums, and the last point for returning the last digit of the calculated sum as the check digit. So yeah, you can have different solutions, but still get the final answer. So that was part A, and part B is to write the isValid method. And then again, this method returns true if its parameter, num with check digit, which represents a number containing a check digit, is valid, and false otherwise. The check digit is always the rightmost digit of num with check digit. So for example, if we wanted to call isValid on 1592, the number is 159 and the check digit is 2. So what we want to check is if 2 is 159's check digit. And that's what getCheck does. If we give getCheck a number, it returns that number's check digit. So in this case, getCheck of 159 returns 2, and the check digit they gave us 2. That means we return true, since those two are equal to each other. So we want to complete the method isValid below. And like before, we must use getCheck to get full credit. There was a point in the other one for that. So, and we need to return a Boolean, and we're given a number with a check digit. So again, I'm just going to show you the code that I wrote, which is slightly different from what they wrote. So we got is valid, and we get an integer, which is a number with the check digit. So to just get the number, you can do the number with check digit divided by 10. So for example, if our number with the check digit is 1592, if we divide that by 10, it would be 159.2. But because this is integer division, that last 0.2 gets cut off, so we just get 159, which is the number we want. That's how we get the number. To get the check digit, we can call get check on this number we just got. So this is the check digit that we should have. And then to get the check digit of is valid, to get the num with check digits like last number, to get this 2, what we can just do num with check digit mod 10. So to explain how that would work, if our num with check digit is 1592, modulus would divide it by 10 and return the remainder. So 1592 divided by 10 is 1592 divided by 10 is 159 with a remainder of 2. So it would return that 2, which is the last digit. So this is the last digit of the input, and this is the check digit that we're looking for. So this returns if those two are equal. If those two are the same, it'll return true, and if they're not, it'll return false. That was my code for it, and if we look at AP's code, they wrote out a few more variables. So they did the same thing as B, they got the number by dividing the num with check digit by 10. And they also got the new check, they got the check digit it should be by doing get check on the number. And in my code, I just put this here. They put it into a variable. They put the check digit of the input into a variable. And then if both of the check digits were the same, it returned true, else it returned false. So to look at the scoring criteria for this, one point is for getting the check digit of num with check digit. Another point is to obtain the number remaining in check digit after the check digit is removed. So that's for getting just the number without the check digit. Now, another point is for calling get check on number without check digit. So make sure you use those functions. And then 8 is to compare the check digit of the 2 digits you got. And then 9 is just to return true or false. And that's it for the questions we're going to go over. If there are any questions, please ask now.
Yeah, so I got a good question in the private chat about printing out this object. So something like, here, let me just type it in. It was like println this. And it happened in a class that they'd given in the example. So remember, this is referring to the current object. And when you're printing out an object, by default, it will print out like some random memory address. But you can override the toString method. Remember, all classes have this. The object is the topmost class in the hierarchy, and all subclasses extend the object class. And you can override that toString method to return whatever you want. So printing out, doing println this would print out whatever that toString method returns. So that's something to note. It's not going to print out the word this, it'll just print out whatever the toString method for that object returns. And that was a really good question. So thank you for asking. Are there any other questions about any content at all from the AP CSA exam? Madhu and Kanish took it last year, so they know what it's like. Or I think Madhu took it last year.
I did.
Okay, yeah.
Yep.
Well, if there are no additional questions, I'd like to thank you guys for coming to our club meeting. And I know most of you are juniors, so I hope to see you again next year for our clubs. And before you leave, I just wanted to share this Google form with you to indicate. Oh, wait, actually, I got a private question. Let me just take a look at that.
Are you doing this next week or is this the last week?
Yeah, that's another thing that we want to ask you guys. Would you be in? I don't know how many of you are taking the exam virtually. If you're taking it in person, the exam's on May 4th, I want to say, or May 5th.
6th.
It's on May 6th.
I think so. Let me look at the date. Yeah, May 6th.
So for those of you who are taking it virtually, would you be interested in a second session? You can just let us know in the chat. This session was also recorded. It'll be going on YouTube, so you can come back and refer to this stuff. And if you have questions, you can email us. Okay, so it looks like more people want a second session, so we can consider doing that. And I don't know if you're in the Google Classroom for Computer Science Club, or if you're in the Computer Science Remind organization, but we'll post an announcement over there. And Ms. Horden can also post it again to all her classes for APCSA. That's something that we can do, and we'll let you know when that will be. Okay, and I'll give you the link to the YouTube. Wait, Madhu, can you get the link to the YouTube channel in the chat?
Yeah, 1 second. Someone sent me a DM in the chat. If you wanna,
Okay.
I can
then
direct it to you.
that?
I wasn't really sure
Okay.
what to say to it, honestly.
Java docs are not required for the FRQ. When you have to write the code for the class and the methods, Java docs is not required.
Yeah, that's
That's a
the
good
best
question.
part of the exam, honestly. No Java docs.
Usually the exam will have Java docs helping you write the correct method.
Kanish, do you know how to respond to that?
Or
Okay.
I'm gonna take it next week.
I'm not really sure. Like when I took it, it just had like 2 FRQ questions. Like I don't really know like how to respond to that question. I'm sorry. But someone
What-
asked, what are the things in your opinion that people forget the most during the exam?
Oh, Miss Horden knows about that, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's something that people forget the most. I think some of the biggest problem is not using the correct variables, because a lot of times they'll say, okay, your object class has a banana and an apple, and then you're supposed to do something with those variables. And instead of banana and apple, they call it fruit and squash, whatever. So then the rubric says, did you correctly fill apple? And no, you didn't, because you filled fruit instead. So be careful to find your variables. I know one of the funniest, I thought 2 years ago, I was grading one, and it's like one of them I recently assigned where they did not give you the variables. And somebody, it was the step tracker one. So I graded step tracker. But step tracker didn't give you the variables. So you had to come up with the variables you thought were needed. And one of the students replied that we didn't give him enough variables, so he couldn't come up with the right answer. And that's true, we didn't give him enough. He was supposed to declare them himself. So he realized he was missing variables, but he didn't go do it. But I think some of the biggest problems are not looping right, trying to put an if-else statement in there. I tried to talk some about that this week. So if you're looking for the min and you start your loop and you say, if this number is lower than, well, actually it wouldn't be min, it would be if you're looking for a specific number. So if this is it, return true, else return false. Well, you're only checking the first value. So we call that an early return because you only looked at the first number. The rubric will say, did you correctly trace all values? No, because you left after the first one. So you're going to lose a lot of points for doing that. The reverse is also true, where they just say found equals true or found equals false. And so they get to the end and they say, if this is it, found equals true, else found equals false. So the answer is based off the last value only. So again, You would get the points for hitting every value, but you wouldn't get the point for correctly assigning the value. But my biggest thing to you is to look through the problem, and if maybe you don't know how to solve all pieces of it, realize that they typically are looking for assignments, calculations. Did you correctly access every value? So even if you can't figure out anything else to do, write a for loop and somehow access the variable that they think you're tracing through. Because maybe you'll accidentally get that point based on how they write the rubric. But don't worry if you can't do every single thing. Just write what you know and as much as you can, and you might get some of the points.
Okay, that's some good feedback. And the
Remember,
last,
everybody grading is looking for ways to give you the points, and please do not describe your code to us. If we can't read your code, then we certainly are not going to need a description of it, because we still wouldn't know what we were doing. So everybody there is graded many, many times, and we don't need your description, so don't waste your time doing that. Just format it neatly, write neatly so we can read it. I can't grade what I can't read.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the last thing that I wanted to share with you guys was a potential summer course that we may plan on having over the summer. I'll just go ahead and share the screen. I put the link into the chat for the Google form. It's not a sign up form, it's just an interest form. And this would be, I know like a third of you in the meeting right now have attended computer science club meetings throughout the year, and you've been competing in some competitions or solving problems with us and learning content. So this summer course would be an advanced algorithms and data structure summer course covering some of the content featured over here. And if you're interested in doing this, you can just specify when you would like to take it, like what days work for you, as well as what weeks. We've not set a deadline yet or decided whether or not the course will go on. But if you're interested, just fill out this form, submit it, and you also provide your email so that way we can email you if we decide to do the course and let you know when it will be. And then you can actually sign up. But yeah, if you guys are interested, this is just something you can do, sign up for. It will be taught by us or me. And if there are no additional questions about the CSA exam, thank you guys for coming. We hope you found this review useful. And I know a lot of you said that you would like a second review. So we look forward to seeing you then and next year as well, hopefully, for the 2021-2022 school year in Computer Science Club.